In the 1940s, bubonic plague was officially considered a defeated disease, a distant trauma associated with the Middle Ages, walled cities, and mass graves. Modern medicine believed that enemy had been left behind. Bacteria were understood. Transmission was mapped. New drugs were beginning to emerge. To military doctors, plague no longer seemed to have a place in the modern world, but that confidence hid a dangerous mistake. The plague had not been eradicated. It had simply retreated, quietly. It still existed where it always had, in wild rodent populations, in rural regions of Asia, Africa, and Eastern Europe, in places where human contact was limited but constant enough to keep it alive. For decades, these reservoirs remained out of sight, until the war connected the world in a way that had never happened before. Troops moving without pause, cargo crossing oceans, ports operating around the clock, millions of people displaced. The war did not bring the plague back. It merely opened the door. And when plague meets movement, it finds opportunity. The first symptoms rarely seemed alarming. A sailor with a fever, another with intense chills, a third complaining of deep body pain. In wartime, that was routine. Exhaustion, infection, sleep deprivation. But then came the sign that changed everything. A hard, painful swelling under the arm. Another in the groin, growing fast, burning, impossible to ignore. At that moment, naval doctors stopped thinking in statistics and started thinking in containment. Because if it was what it appeared to be, there was no margin for error. On land, an outbreak could be isolated, areas evacuated, people separated. At sea, that logic simply did not exist. A ship was a closed world, a steel body floating weeks away from the nearest port. Inside it, hundreds of men lived in constant proximity. Shared bunks, reused uniforms, tools passed hand to hand, recycled air, dark holds packed with food, and inevitably, rats. Many rats. They moved freely through cargo, pipes, and technical compartments. And where rats existed, fleas followed. The plague did not need a massive breach. One entry point was enough. When a suspected case appeared on board, the response was immediate and silent. The patient was isolated below deck, far from common areas. Access was restricted, contact minimized, no announcement to the crew, no explanation. The name of the disease was never spoken, not because the doctors didn't know, but because they understood exactly what that word could do. Panic, fear, collapse of morale. In war, that could be as destructive as the enemy. Naval physicians worked under constant pressure. They knew the plague of the 1940s was no longer the automatic death sentence of the past. Sulfa drugs had changed the outcome. Early treatment drastically reduced mortality, but time was cruel. At sea, hours mattered. Days were dangerous. Each rising fever, each prolonged delirium brought a question no one wanted to voice. And if it wasn't just the bubonic form, the possibility of pneumonic plague was the true nightmare. A variant capable of spreading through the air. Coughing, breathing, proximity. Inside a sealed steel ship, that scenario was unthinkable. That fear shaped every decision, even when no one spoke it aloud. Even without explanations, sailors noticed changes. Names vanished from duty rosters. Compartments were sealed without warning. Chemicals were released through corridors at night. Transfers happened without reason. No one asked too many questions. In wartime, learning not to know was a form of survival. The ocean already felt hostile enough. The thought that an ancient disease might be on board made those steel walls feel closer, tighter, almost fragile. If plague entered a ship, the real challenge was no longer just medical. It became an operational threat. A warship could not simply stop. It could not evacuate. It could not divide its crew. Everything had to keep functioning while a medieval disease was being fought in silence behind sealed steel doors. Naval doctors were trained to act quickly, but also to avoid panic. They knew fear spread faster than any bacterium. Every step was calculated. The patient was removed from routine without clear explanation. A temporary reassignment, an infectious condition, nothing more. Isolation took place below deck, in improvised compartments away from normal traffic. Human contact was reduced to the absolute minimum. Gloves, masks, rigid procedures, all done with the knowledge that a single mistake could turn one case into a collective crisis. Treatment began immediately. Sulfonamides were administered as soon as suspicion became serious. There was no time to hesitate. Waiting for full confirmation could cost lives. Fever was monitored constantly. The pain caused by the swellings was intense, often disabling. Compresses, forced rest, and hydration were applied while the body fought something humanity believed it had left centuries behind. Some patients responded. Others deteriorated too quickly. But the response did not end with the patient. The entire ship was treated as a risk zone. Bunks were destroyed. Uniforms burned. Personal items discarded. Entire sections were sealed off. Chemical fumigation filled corridors in the early hours of the morning while most of the crew slept. The smell lingered for hours. A quiet reminder that something serious was being fought, even if no one said what it was. Then came the hardest decision of all: to dock or not to dock. A ship suspected of carrying plague became a logistical nightmare. Allowing entry into port risked spreading infection to workers, soldiers, and civilians. Denying entry meant leaving sick men isolated at sea with limited resources. Often the solution was waiting. The ship remained anchored offshore. Medical evaluations were conducted remotely. Orders arrived by radio, wrapped in neutral technical language. Nothing that could spark alarm. For the crew, time stretched unnaturally. Days felt longer. Routine continued, but under tension. No one spoke openly, yet everyone felt it. Sharper glances, longer silences. Every cough drew attention. Every fever raised concern. In a closed environment, uncertainty became as suffocating as the steel itself. There was one fear rarely written in reports: the fear that control might already be lost. Because if the plague had spread beyond the initial case, no protocol could stop panic. A ship could not be emptied. It could not be segmented. It could not disconnect from the world. It moved forward, carrying its problem with it. In most cases, control held. Not because the threat was small, but because vigilance was relentless. The plague was treated as something that had to be neutralized before it became visible. Not as a historical event, but as an administrative problem that could not leave paper. When the war ended, these stories were not highlighted. They did not fit the narrative of technological triumph and scientific dominance. Admitting that a medieval disease had traveled aboard modern ships was deeply uncomfortable, so the records remained fragmented. Silence prevailed once again. But for those who were there, the memory remained. The memory that, in the greatest conflict of the century, the danger was not only armed enemies. It was something far older, something invisible, something that needed no weapons to move, only a path. Before we wrap this up, let me ask you something real quick. Where are you watching this from right now? Maybe a coastal city? Or somewhere you'd never expect to be connected to a story like this? Drop your city and state in the comments, because I genuinely want to know how far these stories are reaching, and if this hidden side of World War II kept you watching. Hit the like button. It tells YouTube that serious, in-depth history like this matters. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now to learn more about the diseases, fears, and psychological threats faced during World War II. There's much more to this war than what history books usually tell us.